Hi, everyone. These are the lecture notes for Chapter 7 on cellular respiration. The overview, I am going to read through it and talk with you a little bit about cellular respiration and what you're going to learn in this chapter. But if you read this overview, it's a little bit overwhelming. We are going to be learning a lot of chemistry in this chapter, but you will not have to, you won't have to memorize all of the chemical reactions. Um, Basically, the best way I know to explain it is that cellular respiration is one overall chemical reaction. It is when our cells take glucose and oxygen and use the oxygen to help break down the glucose into carbon dioxide and water. And in the process, ATP is generated. And ATP is the molecule that our cells use for energy. I always think of ATP as the what our cells use for money. So when we want to buy products, if we want to buy something at a store, we use money. We go up to the cashier and we give the cashier money, or either in the form of dollars or in the form of a card of some sort. But ATP is like the money or the currency that our cells use when our cells need to buy energy. So ATP is the currency that our cells use for energy. And ATP, the more ATP that your cells produce, the more energy that your cells have. So cells extract energy from food, and our food can be broken down into different things, but we use glucose because um, almost always the carbohydrates that we eat are broken down into glucose, and then it's the breakdown of glucose or glucose catabolism that leads to the production of ATP. So that is one overall chemical reaction. Glucose plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide and water and ATP. But that is not how the reaction occurs. It occurs in many, many different steps and 4 different metabolic pathways. So a metabolic pathway is just a series of chemical reactions. And there are 4 different metabolic pathways involved in cellular respiration. And we are going to discuss the role of electrons in those metabolic pathways. And then lastly, this incremental transfer of electrons allows the cell to transfer food energy in small packages that can be captured in the phosphate bonds of ATP. ATP actually stands for adenosine triphosphate. So what that tells us is that ATP contains 3 phosphate groups attached to adenosine, and the energy comes from removal of a phosphate group. Okay. Now, before we move on and talk more about cellular respiration, we do need to understand one chemical concept, and that is oxidation reduction reactions. Oxidation reduction reactions. And often this is shortened to redox. Redox just means oxidation reduction. So in an oxidation reduction reaction, one molecule is oxidized and one is reduced. Now, reduction means the gain of electrons. Oxidation means the loss of electrons. So there is a mnemonic device that can help you, and it is oil rig. If you have taken chemistry before, you already know this. But if you haven't, Oil rig means oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. So reduction is the gain of electrons, and oxidation is the loss of electrons. So what happens in a chemical reaction is you'll have some chemical A and some chemical X. A is going to be your reducing agent because it has a hydrogen atom attached to it. And then X is going to be the agent that the hydrogen will be transferred to. So what you have to understand is that a hydrogen atom contains one proton and one electron. That's it. It doesn't contain any neutrons. So if a hydrogen is transferred to this chemical X, it's donating an electron. It's an electron donor. So it's called the reducing agent because it's causing X to gain electrons. So what happens is the chemical A, H, is the reducing agent because it's the one that donates the electrons in the form of a hydrogen atom. And X is the oxidizing agent because it's the one that accepts the electron in the form of a hydrogen atom. And you can see what happens is that the chemical A, which is oxidized because it lost the electron in the form of hydrogen, and then X is reduced because it gained an electron in the form of hydrogen. So this is going to happen many times, many times throughout the process of cellular respiration. So two chemicals that I want you to know about and recognize that are reducing agents are NADH and FADH2. NADH, as you can see, contains a hydrogen atom on the end, and FADH2 contains two hydrogen atoms on the end. So these molecules are reducing agents because they're able to donate hydrogen, which carries an electron with it. So in other words, they're able to donate an electron, and they're called electron carriers. And electron carriers are going to be very important in generating ATP, which is what the ultimate goal that our cells are trying to reach in cellular respiration. Now, once the ATP is produced, how do the cells actually extract energy from it? Well, if you'll look at this chemical, this is the adenosine part. This is the adenosine part. Okay? It is actually a nucleotide. This is a nucleotide attached to the sugar ribose. But then after that, here are your phosphate groups. 1, 2, 3. And if one phosphate group is removed, by breaking that phosphate bond, energy can be released. It's a high energy molecule. So when you lose one of those phosphate groups, the ATP becomes ADP. ATP stands for 3 phosphates or triphosphate, and ADP stands for diphosphate or 2 phosphates. So what happens is when ATP loses a phosphate, it becomes ADP or adenosine diphosphate, and then PI stands for the phosphate group that is lost. So once ATP is broken down into ADP, that is where the energy comes from. Okay, now the opposite of that is what happens to form ATP. Your ADP, which has 2 phosphate groups, adds another phosphate group to become ATP. This can happen in 2 different ways. It can happen through substrate level phosphorylation. Phosphorylation simply means to add a phosphate group. Or it can happen by oxidative phosphorylation. I'm not going to write phosphorylation because you can see it right there, but oxidative phosphorylation produces more ATP. It's much more energy efficient. And oxidative phosphorylation uses a process called chemiosmosis, and it uses an enzyme called ATP synthase. We are going to see this process in the fourth step of cellular respiration. But those are the two ways that a phosphate can be added to ADP to create ATP: substrate level phosphorylation or oxidative phosphorylation. And I'll explain both ways. But now let's go back to the overall equation for cellular respiration. Here is the overall chemical equation, and I do want you to know this one by heart, memorized. I want you to be able to write it out from memory, both in the chemical formulas and words. But this will be the only chemical reaction you will have to know from memory, is the overall chemical reaction for cellular respiration. So C6H12O6 is a 6-carbon molecule, and it's called glucose. When we eat carbohydrates, which are a large part of our diet in America, the carbohydrates are broken down by our digestive system into glucose. And then oxygen, of course, comes from the air when we breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere. So glucose, in the presence of oxygen, forms the gas carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and we eventually breathe out the carbon dioxide that builds up in our cells because it is toxic. And it also forms 6 molecules of water. But the entire purpose of this reaction is to produce about 36 ATP molecules. So this is your overall equation. You need to know it in words, and you need to know it in chemical formula. Now, cellular respiration has one overall equation, yes, but it doesn't happen all in one step. If you look at the equation at the top, it's misleading because it makes it seem like that this happens all in one step. But there are actually 4 metabolic pathways that all contain several chemical reactions. In fact, glycolysis contains 10 different chemical reactions, and that's just one metabolic pathway. So here are your metabolic pathways. Glycolysis is the first one. Oxidation of pyruvate is number 2. The citric acid cycle is number 3. And oxidative phosphorylation is number 4. So oxidative phosphorylation, step 4, is the only step that produces ATP this way. In the other steps that produce ATP, in glycolysis and in the citric acid cycle, these 2 steps also produce a small amount of ATP. They're going to produce ATP by substrate level phosphorylation. And I will explain the difference, but they produce ATP in a different way. So they're not able to produce as much. You're going to find out that oxidative phosphorylation is much more energy efficient. It produces much more ATP. But we're going to start with glycolysis, and glycolysis can be scary. And if you don't understand that, I don't require you to know it like you would have to know it if you were taking a biochemistry class or organic chemistry class. I don't require for you to know and memorize the 10 different reactions that occur in glycolysis. But I do require that you know where it occurs. It occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. And I do require that you know that oxygen is not required in this pathway. So we call that anaerobic when oxygen is not required. And I also want you to know the products of glycolysis are 2 NADH molecules, which we have learned are electron carriers, 2 pyruvate molecules, and 2 ATP molecules are produced. 4 ATP are produced and 2 are used. So overall, 2 ATP molecules are produced by substrate level phosphorylation.